Today we have Gordon Dunsire, RDA expert, former chair of the RDA steering committee, and we have Thurston Young and Alan Danskin from the British Library, who will be sharing their expertise also. So I think we can now say that we've got a fair number of registrants joined the meeting, and it would be fair to move to getting Gordon to share with us his first short presentation on the customization of the RDA toolkit. So everyone who is not already, please mute and switch off your video, apart from Gordon, who's going to share his screen with us. Thank you, Gordon.
So you should be seeing my screen, I hope.
Yeah.
Okay, this is just a brief set of slides. Bits and pieces have been cobbled together from other presentations, really just to set the scene for further discussion later in the webinar. So the new RDA toolkit is full of options. Nearly all of the instructions are optional. The reason for this is internationalization. It's proved impossible in the past. It was impossible during the development of RDA, and I'm quite sure it will be impossible in the future to get everybody to agree to exactly what options they wish to use in every circumstance. So RDA, the new toolkit, is much more like a framework to make sure that whatever options you take result in data that conforms to RDA and is indeed interoperable to a certain extent with the data produced by anybody else who's using an RDA. I know this puzzles quite a lot of people. The tradition has been you get told what to do, they're called rules, etc. But that's really not appropriate for the 21st century and this age of the internet. So virtually everything is optional. Exactly what you do from the toolkit, the choice of what to choose is yours. But when you choose an option in the toolkit, you're also choosing which element you're going to use and the recording method. The reason is that there is a standard layout for every page, which has a pre-recording section followed by sections for every recording method, whether it's applicable or not. And all instructions are then put in the context of the pre-recording section or the recording method section. So an optional instruction is usually found tied in to a specific recording method for a specific element. And of course, when you choose the element, you're also choosing the entity. There are some options in pre-recording sections, but they tend to be redirections to use another element. The pre-recording section is there to remind the cataloger to consider that there may be another element that is more suitable to use to describe whatever it is you're describing in hand. So as well as a great deal of contextualized optional instructions, RDA also provides a set of controlled terms known as a value vocabulary for some of the attribute elements. These tend to have been assigned on a historical basis, but this is still ongoing. Just before the new toolkit was published, in fact, as part of the new toolkit, 2 new value vocabularies were added for type of binding and units of time. So RDA continues to supply a potential set of values to use in describing something. Today, rather than tradition, the general consideration is whether there is a suitable value available elsewhere, because it's all about choice. In both instances, type of binding, and we can discuss this later on in the webinar in a specific use case, we couldn't find vocabulary which exactly matched the requirements of the new type of binding element. And similarly, and this is quite surprising, we couldn't find a definitive list of calendrical time units like day, week, month, etc. that could be translated. So that's the reason why in both instances, new value vocabularies were provided for those elements. However, the use of an RDA value vocabulary is always optional, and none of them are mandatory. And a local vocabulary can be substituted wherever there is an RDA value vocabulary. And indeed, many of the attribute elements don't have an RDA vocabulary, but have an optional instruction to use any suitable vocabulary that is applicable to the thing being described. There's a slight terminology thing here. There's quite a lot of slight terminology things with the new toolkit. It's because it straddles the two worlds of traditional cataloging terminology and the new terminology of machine readable cataloging, linked data, etc. So a value vocabulary is a kind or category of what's referred to in the toolkit as a VES, or vocabulary encoding scheme. So those VESs, the value vocabularies, generally apply to attribute elements. For relationship elements, RDA certainly does not specify any source of data for the value of a related entity. So there's no specific data sets, authority files, or instance vocabularies. These all mean the same thing. For relationship elements. Instead, the toolkit expects that most cataloging agencies will already be using a local vocabulary. Local here, I have to stress again, doesn't mean within a nation. It can mean something that's widespread, international, and global, but in a global environment, in a machine readable global environment, it is regarded as a local vocabulary. So even Library of Congress Name Authority File or VIAF, the Virtual International Authority File, are regarded as local vocabularies by the toolkit. A data set or instance vocabulary is another of the categories of VESs. And just to complete the picture here, this is not in the toolkit, but these categories were taken from the report of the W3C Library Linked Data Incubator Group, which is about 10 years old now. And that group identified 3 distinct categories of controlled and encoded sets of metadata values. There's the data set, which describes instances of entities. I'm an instance of a person. This presentation is an instance of a work. Another category is the value vocabulary, which are terminology concepts, as I've explained. And then finally, there is the metadata element set, or just plain element set, which is a vocabulary outlining the data model of entities, elements, etc., that are being used. That third vocabulary is delivered in context within the toolkit, but there's no specific isolation of it. That occurs in the RDA registry, which also includes the value vocabularies as well. But data sets is well outside of RDA's scope. Huge numbers of metadata sets describing people, places, works, etc., etc. Vocabulary encoding scheme itself, no matter what category it falls within, Also typically offers a choice of values for any specific concept or instance or entry in the vocabulary. Usually at least two or all three of a structured or controlled access point for human readability is offered. An identifier or notation for local database readability may be offered, and an internationalized resource identifier may also be present for linked data, for global linked data. So again, catalogers have a choice, even if the vocabulary and indeed the term has been chosen. There are still three different ways of entering a value to correspond to that choice. Furthermore, these categories of values align with the RDA recording methods. And we'll discuss that in a bit more detail when at the next webinar, which will focus on the RDA recording methods. The final thing I want to say to point out is that RDA is open. It expects to be refined and indeed augmented by local applications, local agencies. So any RDA entity, element, or concept can be refined with a local entity, provided that local entity, etc., is narrower in meaning. If an application wished to subdivide the entity person into men and women, a highly questionable decision in the 21st century, but nonetheless might exist, then they are free to do so, to define sub-entities of person which are male or female, or indeed could be adult and child. An element can be refined with a narrower meaning, or indeed a value vocabulary concept can also be refined, provided it has a narrower meaning than the published one. Some of the RDA value vocabularies can be extended with a local concept. The one I use as an example here is material. So RDA offers a set of controlled terms for material, but it is by no means comprehensive, consistent, or indeed coherent, because it has grown up over time. It is also a compilation of terms that were used for base material, microform emulsions, and applied materials. All of those concepts have been collapsed into the idea of material. So it contains entries like plastic and metal and iron, but it doesn't have a comprehensive list of metals. It certainly doesn't have a comprehensive list of plastic types like PVC, etc. And that is a prime example of a vocabulary that could be easily and readily extended with a local concept. But it goes without saying that if you're going to use a local value for material, it really ought to be a material and not something that you've made up. So those extensions must be within the scope of the value vocabulary. In other extensions, you have to do it formally. So this is, you can do these things without recourse to changing RDA as a standard. But if you want to add a new entity to one of the closed value vocabularies, a new concept, sorry, or a new entity that is not narrower than one of the existing RDA entities, you must do that through the normal development processes within the RSC itself. Okay, this is for the next part. So that's me done with my slides for this section.
Thank you, Gordon. While Thurston switches on his video, I will say that Thurston is going to talk with us about policy statements and share how the British Library have worked with those. Are you ready to go, Thurston?
I am.
Great.
Can you see my
yep, you're
screen there?
Screen,
Great.
We can hear you.
Okay.
That's all good. I'll sign over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to show you the work that the British Library has done so far on policy statements, where you can find them within the toolkit, and some of the functionality and structure associated with them. So from your welcome page on the new toolkit, if you navigate to the policies menu, you'll see a drop down which includes BLPS and LCPCCPS. So the British Library policy statements can be navigated to from the top button, and then you get a choice between BLPS entities, and if any policy statements associated with elements belong to entities, or the BLPS guidance. So I'm going to click on entities here, and then you get taken to a menu of BLPS entities, and any live links there basically indicate that there has been content uploaded for those. Anything that is not a live link has yet to be populated. So I'm going to go to the manifestation menu. And here you find a page listing all of the elements for which policy statements have been populated so far. Now, we're right at the beginning of this process. For the manifestation entity alone, there are over several hundred separate elements for which we could populate policy statements, and we've done about 30 so far, and those 30 or so are based on the URIG application, basic application profile for a manifestation, which we concentrated on in the first instance. So I'm going to go into the first one of these at the top of the menu, carrier type. And what this takes you to is a mirror page for the policy statement. So it basically provides you with all the policy statements that have been recorded under the separate section headings for pre-recording, recording, unstructured, structured, description, and identifier and IRI. And then you can leap from any of the live links there into the associated RDA base file. And there you will see the policy statements appearing in the right rail of the page alongside the option to which they relate. And in terms of the approach that the British Library have taken, it's to have policy statements that are as succinct as possible. As you can see, the amount of space that's available beside each option can be quite limited, and there is a send to back feature which you can use in case a policy statement effectively runs over into the territory of a subsequent one or not, but that's not something that we've had to concern ourselves about so far in terms of the text that we've recorded. And in terms of the text we have recorded, we've followed a process of creating boilerplate. So what is boilerplate? Well, boilerplate is basically stock standard phrases that we can use again and again in order to record particular policy. So that may be to not apply an option using do not apply, to exercise catalogue of judgment when deciding to record an option, and if a condition is associated with an option, to apply if applicable, things like that. The value of boilerplate is that basically you can reuse it on multiple occasions. If you decide to change boilerplate at a later point in time, you can do so and then roll it out wherever else the same boilerplate has occurred. It reduces the need for individual keying of phrases. You can basically, as I say, reuse them again and again. And in terms of the other functionality I want to demonstrate, yes, right at the top of the page, you have the option to select a particular policy statement set. So at the moment we're displaying the ones for the British Library, but you can toggle to sets belonging to other communities from this drop down. And as you can see there now, we've got some examples of the Library of Congress policy statements. And here we've got an example where you might want to send something to the back so that you can see the full extent of the previous policy statement there. So that's one example. Now I'm going to show you a couple of variations on a theme. So next I'm going to go to title of series. And the structure is pretty much the same, but I just want to bring your attention to some of the other values that we're recording for policy statements. So here we've got a policy statement, do not apply pending Mark 21 change. There are various elements within the new toolkit for which there is no means to record that element in a Mark 21 context at present. And the Mark RDA working group is working through various aspects of the new RDA, seeing if it's possible to record those in a Mark 21 context, and if it's desirable to do so at the present time. Here we have the option to record a manifestation series statement. And as part of the latest update to Mark 21, update 31, it became possible to record manifestation statements using a new field 881 in the bibliographic format. So in the fullness of time, this is something that we will want to change our policy statement on. Another thing to bear in mind is also that a given community may have exceptions from their standard approach when applying a particular option, and you can see here some cases in point. So the standard approach for recording a value that appears in the language or script of a title proper would, in terms of this first option here, would to be not apply. But from our perspective, our early printed resource workflow would be to apply that option. So we have those exceptions there. And lastly, I just want to emphasize that this is a work in progress. So if we go to dimensions of still image, you'll see that we've got two of the options populated with policy statements there, but the third one is not. And to some extent, we're still playing a game of catch up from the updates that have been issued since these policy statements have been populated. And as I said at the outset, in terms of the numbers that we've done so far, they're very relatively small when compared against the size of the new RDA element set and the number of options that are available all told to record for the element set and the guidance instructions. So that being the case, we are at present we've gone down the manual entry route in terms of creating policy statements within the RDA's content management system, but we're hoping to get up and running a batch process that would make this a far quicker and more streamlined exercise. The only other thing I think it worth pointing out is the dependency between new policy statements appearing and the release schedule of the toolkit. So new policy statements can be rolled out whenever a release of the toolkit takes place. And as things stand for this year, releases are scheduled to take place in April, July and October. And that's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Thurston. I couldn't find my mute button there for a second. That's really useful. Thank you. I haven't been sent any specific questions for you, so we'll carry on with the...
No, let's have a chat about policy statements, Jenny.
Okay, go for it, Gordon.
So I can add a little bit to that. I thought the early printed resources thing, which was new to me, by the way, I used to sit in on these discussions with Thurston when I was a member of RSC. So that's a new thing that I've seen. What I'm aware of is, as well as the British Library and the Library of Congress and Programme for Collaborative Cataloguing policy statements, the Music Libraries Association and the Rare Book Committee organisation are also in the process of adding their policies to the toolkit using exactly the same infrastructure. So there's going to be a clear overlap there, I would have thought, Thurston, between what they produce for rare books and British Library policy on early printed resources. So I was wondering if you had a comment on that. Do you have plans for reducing duplication or being smarter in the future?
I think there's certainly potential for that. And it will be interesting to see whether we choose to increase the functionality present in our policy statements to include, for example, C references to other community policy statements where they're more comprehensive. I think that'd certainly be a case for that. Yes, we're very much at the beginning of this process. I don't know whether Alan has anything that he'd like to add to that.
Well, one or two things I was going to comment on. From a point of view of the rare books community, we're actually involved in those discussions as well. So when we set out to document our policy statements, we took a decision to base our policy statements on current policies because we had no other framework really to work with. And so what we've got at the moment largely reflects our current policy for rare books or for anything else. But obviously we have a member of staff who's involved in the work with the rare books material. So that's gradually being, so most of our policies are actually based on the policies of that group. So we may not, so, you know, how are we going to, I'm not sure exactly whether we're going to use cross-references within the policy statements or not, or whether we're going to say something like, we'll have a blanket exception, which is what we've actually had in practice so far with the current toolkit, and that for manifestation descriptions, our early printed materials people follow rare books guidance. But for everything else, access points, etc., they follow RDA. So we're still kind of finding our way on what's going to work. And obviously, as things are developing at different paces in different parts of the forest, it's difficult to keep things in sync. The other thing I wanted to point out is Thurston pointed out there's about 60 policies in the toolkit. That's not to imply that we've only done 60 policy statements. We have done thousands. Which is why we need a batch process to load them. And we've recently received some software from Library of Congress that we're about to start testing, I think.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen again briefly. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, we've got you now.
There you go. Okay. Right. Yes. So Alan has just referred to the policy statements that we've written so far. We have a set of spreadsheets behind the scenes, which we've been populating within the British Library over the past year or so. So, yes, in terms of a lot of the intellectual work, that has been done, but there is an extra step in terms of actually transferring that in terms of what you can see here. I'll just get the relevant column, proposed policy, into the toolkit itself. So yeah, in terms of the Library of Congress, they have basically produce an XSLT transform, which has enabled them to load batches, hundreds at a time, of policy statements into the toolkit, and that's something that we're hoping to emulate.
Thanks, Martin. The other thing I was going to mention in relation to policy statements is that we've been recently talking to the legal deposit libraries about whether they would like to have policy statements incorporated within, as the other UK legal deposit libraries, whether they would like to have specific policy statements incorporated into our framework, which it would be good to do that if we're going to do it before we start loading lots more policy statements. So that would mean that our policy statements would use the same kind of structure as the Library of Congress, who are providing policy statements for themselves and for PCC. And so that conversation has began in about towards the end of last year, and is moving forward at the moment.
That's interesting, thank you.
I've got a couple of other comments then. I know that the infrastructure that's used to produce one set of policy statements could be used for another. So I think there's an opportunity in the fullness of time. It's very much baby steps at the moment, I understand that. To have, for example, a British Library early printed works policy statements, which would be separate from the British Library policy statements. And that kind of breakout into material specific things, because that seems to be the way that the communities currently want to approach this. So we got rare books and music, you know, these are material specific communities. We have taken account of this within the underlying organization of the RDA instructions. So this is not visible in the toolkit, but it's there kind of in preparation for future developments. So we have started to flag certain instructions and options as being only for rare books or only for music materials. And clearly there are a number of elements that have no application outside of a specific material. So I'm just making a comment that I think the infrastructure is far more flexible than it was in the past. And there are many ways now, in my opinion, of developing all of this. And it'd be quite interesting to see if different agencies actually take different approaches, so that the full gamut could be explored. On the other hand, I understand Alan's comments that the agencies are actually there to do a job and not play and test things for RDA. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. The other comment I want to make, this has already been talked about within the RSC and the policy statement agencies, but I thought it would be worthwhile exposing it, because I'm hoping that at least one person attending this webinar has thought to themselves, if it's do not apply, why is it being shown? You know, why is the toolkit 80% of the British Library policy statement toolkit redundant? It says do not apply. So you've got to plow through all of that stuff to get to the applies. Now, this is a rhetorical question. One of the things, and this is really quite exciting, one of the things that's possible with the new infrastructure is to, this is one way forward, there are many different routes. Thurston's already explained that apply and do not apply are boilerplate. What this actually means is within the content management system, they have machine readable identifiers. It doesn't actually say apply or do not apply, that's only once. When it appears in an option, it is being coded by its identifier. It's a small step then to get agencies to agree on a common coding for apply and do not apply. And then another small step beyond that to have a development of the toolkit, which would indeed suppress elements of the toolkit that did not apply to a particular policy. Now, if we go back and look at all of this in relation to material specific approaches, we have a possibility in the future of having an RDA for music, an RDA for rare materials, an RDA for audio-visual materials, an RDA for 19th century novels published in France with people under 6 feet tall. You know, although that sounds
that would
crazy,
be a way to get application profiles built in.
I'm segueing into the next section, of course. But within the toolkit and just using the infrastructure of policy statements, we can go a very, very long way to certainly what were dreams at the beginning of the RDA Toolkit discussions 10 years ago. I know the ALA Publishing has had this idea from the get-go that at the end of the day, it would be able to publish an RDA for music, for example, that would only contain elements specific to music, etc. So it is like an application profile, but it's built in. So the huge difference between a set of policy statements and an application profile is the policy statements are in situ. They are in context of the toolkit itself, whereas an application profile is external, and the external thing contextualizes the use of the toolkit. So that there's a subtle but quite important difference there. And the technologies and techniques and policies that support either of these approaches are actually significantly different, and that's why different approaches may be chosen by different agencies. So although it's early days yet, I think it'll be great to watch as things unfold over this year, as those BL policy statements get populated throughout the whole toolkit. I think we could probably then move on to thinking about what the next stage of development might be. So this is not the end, it's just the beginning. If I can
meanwhile, other agencies are wondering what they can do in terms of their own policy statements. Question from someone here: could other institutions like universities also create policy statements? Can we use the existing ones, such as those from the BL, and adapt them as we used to do in the old toolkit?
That's technically feasible. The problems are not technical, the problems are political and economic. So there are questions about who's maintaining things. A policy statement within the toolkit is officially part of the toolkit, and therefore it has to have a certain level of quality assurance to it. The agency producing the policy statements has to be vetted and approved by the publisher and by RSC. Having said all of that, then there's no technical barrier to, for example, the NBK and I'm going to come on to this in the context of application profiles next, but even within policy statements, there's absolutely no reason why the NBK shouldn't have a policy statement within the toolkit. The only thing, and when we brainstormed this within RSC, the only thing that is a limiting factor is how many entries you can squeeze in that drop-down list that Thurston showed us. It's only got 2 in it at the moment. Eventually, it could have 20 or 30. Realistically, I think it's going to get up to 50 or 60. Until we make the move over to application profiles. So application profiles have got nothing to do with the toolkit. RSC is not interested. They are just a way of an agency or an individual using the toolkit more effectively. They are essential to the effective use of the toolkit, but they are to be driven by communities, developed by communities. That's why I'm saying RSC is not interested. So RSC will provide the tools to support application profiles, but that's partly why Alan's chairing the application profiles working group. There's a whole bunch of policy issues which that group has been asked to look into, the technical aspects of those policy issues. So that's something that work is ongoing. It's baby steps, and people really can't make competent decisions at this stage because the landscape has not yet been fully exposed to that decision-making process. But certainly I can see this happening in the future. It's been a personal dream of mine well before I started to get engaged with RDA itself. I've always thought it's crazy that, you know, I can't have a simple little interface for cataloging postcards that just points to the instructions, encapsulates it all for me. And, you know, I only need 2 entities and 5 fields. So, you know, it would be great if RDA can be adapted to that. I think we had a demo from Alan about application profiles for postcards or something, or AV or something, at the last UKCoR. Yeah.
Like cylinders, niche.
Yeah. So all of these things are technically feasible. It used to be in the past, you know, people were going, nah, it's a great idea, but we can't afford it or we can't do it. Now it's a question of can we afford it and what's the policy, but we can certainly do these things. So I think that's a great question. And it's something I would hope that people attending this webinar start to think about as a strategic development, say 3 or 4 years from now, to move towards that kind of thing.
Just to add to, or gloss the question that was originally asked, it's quite a big overhead to maintain policy statements, which is what Gordon was getting at. He was saying that everyone has to.
Yeah, the person who asked the questions coming back was saying they agree about the issue about enduring quality of same.
Yeah, but that's not the only way of providing a local policy. You could annotate, use annotations within the toolkit to say where your policy slightly died. But I think that in most cases, people will be doing broadly the same things as other institutions. But if you've got particular nuances, you can annotate within the toolkit for a particular condition or option to say that in our case, this is what we want to do. Yeah. Or you could include it in a workflow document if you create workflow documents. And of course, we'll be making our workflow documents available when we've written some. And people will be able to adapt them to their own uses if they so desire.
Thank you, that's heartening.
Mm.
Okay, Gordon, I think we should come back now to your presentation on application profiles, after which we'll have a short break.
Yeah. Okay, you should see my screen, yes?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
So again, just a brief set of slides as background to what Alan's going to say and further discussion. Right. So an application profile is defined in the toolkit glossary as a specification of the metadata that is used in an application. It's fairly straightforward. There's then a scope note that the specification may include which entities, elements, vocabulary encoding schemes are to be used, and whether elements are mandatory as one issue, and whether they are also repeatable as another issue. Can I have more than one title proper, for example? An RDA application profile confines itself to RDA entities and the toolkit. So an RDA application profile will typically specify which RDA entities are being described. Are you going to use agent or collective agent or corporate body? Because these are in hierarchy, and you can choose, depending on the level of granularity of your metadata, you can choose between those three hierarchical entities. Which RDA elements do you want to use? I've heard some criticisms of the new toolkit that say it's useless because there are, quote, over 300 elements associated with work. And that makes it unwieldy. But of course, many of those elements exist in a hierarchical relationship with one another, and you would never use to record data at two different levels in a hierarchy, unless it was a very strange application indeed. So an AP, an application profile, will tell you which RDA elements, and that will often be tied in with a granularity of description decision. For each element that's specified, is it mandatory? In the guidance in the toolkit, it explains that in fact mandatory and repeatable can be covered by numbers, by saying what is the minimum number of occurrences of an element and what is the maximum number. So a minimum number of 0 occurrences means the element is optional. You're allowed to have 0 occurrences of it. A minimum occurrence of 1 means it's mandatory. A maximum occurrence of not specified means you can have any number of repeats. A maximum occurrence of 3 means you could have 3 repeats of an element, so you could re-invoke the rule of 3 for author persons, etc. So those two things kind of interact with one another. And excuse me while I plug in. They govern basically the breadth of your description. So the granularity is which entities and elements, the breadth is what's mandatory and what's repeatable. Also within an element, you have a choice of recording methods for most elements. So which one are you going to use? Within recording methods, there's quite often more than one option. And so you have to decide which option you're going to use. And then for those attribute elements that allow the use of a value vocabulary or vocabulary encoding scheme, it's which of these are you going to use? Are you going to use the RDA one? Are you going to use another one? Or in fact, are you going to use your own string encoding scheme to compose the structured descriptions in that value vocabulary? Much of this lies in the area of authority control. So one of the things that's probably going to be essential are application profiles for authority control, which would be separate from application profiles for descriptive cataloging, for example. So profile documentation, all of this is being discussed all over the place. Application profiles were first conceived of in the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative back in the mid-90s. Since then, there has been on-off development of the idea by DCMI. There is currently an ongoing task group looking at the specification, machine-readable specification of application profiles. But there have been a number of other groups, and I've mentioned the RSC one that Alan is chairing. So there's no industry standard for doing this. It's a relatively new idea. What is emerging, however, is a structured approach. This is because we try to make application profiles machine readable. And a tabular layout is quite common, using a row for the element or entity you wish to specify, and the columns give the profile characteristics of the element, such as whether they're mandatory or repeatable. In fact, most ongoing initiatives for developing operational application profiles are using spreadsheets. It's the same infrastructure that we use to maintain the RDA registry, in fact. So here I've given a typical sample. This is a tiny part of an AP that would be connected with describing expressions. And it's isolated 3 elements that should be part of the consideration. Content type is mandatory in this application. You must have a content type. It's allowed to repeat. So you can have more than one content type assigned. It specifies that the application uses the RDA, the vocabulary encoding scheme, for content type. That's exhaustive. It covers all possible types, and with types being repeatable, all possible combinations of types are covered. So there's no need for a string encoding scheme to create new content types. And the method is structured. You're going to use a verbal label taken from the RDA content type vocabulary. The date of expression element is not mandatory in this application. If the expression date can't be easily determined, then it's regarded as being duly onerous and would not be recorded. The cataloger is not expected to go and look up reference sources. It's not repeatable, so even if you have a date of expression, in this application, there's only one date that can be recorded. There is no vocabulary encoding scheme for general dates. Instead, there's a very well-established string encoding scheme, ISO 8601, for date time formats. That's the EDTF standard. And again, it's going to be a structured description because you're going to use a string encoding scheme. Finally, language of expression is another mandatory element. This application really wants the language to be recorded. And this, Alan, this is an echo of very, very old problem that you discovered in the British Library many, many years ago, and was discovered in the National Library of Scotland, which was that if the expression was in English, you didn't record its language. How national can you get? So, and in Scotland, it was the same. If it was in Scots, then you may or may not have recorded the language. So language of expression is not going to be repeatable in this application. It's going to use the ISO 6395 encodings for languages. There would be a sub note here to say to use the 3-letter codes and not the 2-letter codes. That's exhaustive, so there's no need for a string encoding scheme. And this time you're going to use the code, which is the identifier, rather than the verbal label, the string label of the language itself. So that profile can be used to produce this output. This is a human readable version of it, and it's presented in metadata statement format in the standard way of a subject, a verb, and an object. So my expression has content type text. My expression has date of expression 2019. 2019 is an encoding, it fits that ISO 8601 standard. And it has language of expression ENG, which is a 3-letter code taken from ISO 6392. But that whole thing can be rendered, same application profile. That whole set of data can be rendered in machine readable format by supplying an instance URI for the subject from my expression, by supplying the predicate, which is from RDA. So these are the 3 RDA elements that are being used, and keeping the objects as they are. So I just wanted to slip that one in to show you that an AP can actually output data that can subsequently be transformed to suit the needs of a different application. So APs are not simple, they're complex objects. And that's meant to be a segue into the next part of this webinar, which will take place after the break.
Thank you, Gordon. I don't think any of us thought application profiles were anything but complicated. As you say, we shall have a short comfort break now, so I will pause the recording and we will reconvene at 3:10. See you all shortly. Okay, we've talked generally about application profiles, but we're now going to look at a more specific setup with Alan's help, who's going to share with us some thoughts on the development of application profiles. Alan, are you ready for that? You're still muted.
You're still muted, Alan.
See that?
Okay.
Oh, you're talking now.
It's an unmute button. I don't know why it doesn't work.
Okay, I'll hand over to you then, Alan.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the complexity that Gordon alluded to before the break. I've got some slides that some of you may have seen before from a meeting in the summer where we looked at kind of outline of the British Library application profile that I've been working on. And I'll also show some examples of how application profiles are being used within RIMF, RDA and many metadata formats. I should say that work is going on in several different communities to develop application profiles. There's work going on within the German-speaking community to develop application profiles for Germany, Austria, and the German-speaking parts of Switzerland. The Bibliothèque Nationale in France is also working on application profiles. And there are many institutions involved in the various Mellon-funded projects looking at linked data, who are developing application profiles around the use of RDA and BibFrame. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm just going to, I hope people can see that.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, we don't need to see all of this because it would take too long to go through it all. But I'm just going to get to the bit about application profiles. Right, so there's a definition of application profiles, which should have appeared on your screen now. And then here's an example. You can see that this is quite similar to the slide that Gordon showed earlier. It has a bit more, a few more columns. So down the left side of this application profile, we've actually got the label for the element in RDA and a couple of other columns recording the identifier for the element and its domain and range, which probably don't need to be visible in most application profiles, even although it's useful information that you might want to have in your application profile. Most people won't want to see them or need to see them. And in fact, it's a question that we've been discussing ourselves, is who actually needs to see the application profile. In fact, most people probably don't need to see the application profile. It will be people involved in the configuration of applications. Catalogers probably won't see the application profile, although they will see outputs from the application profile, of course, in the form of templates, perhaps. So again, like the example that Gordon showed, we've got some cardinality information on saying, you know, is this element a required element or is it not a required element? This is very generic at the moment, and we may change these values to suit our own purposes. And value encoding schemes. This is the sort of generic approach at the moment. This isn't how we would necessarily set it up within the British Library, but this is, so many of these things aren't actually defined in this view of the application profile. But here's the sort of BL implementation, if you like. We're recording, we've included recording methods, transcription methods, value encoding schemes, and SESs and sort of string encoding schemes. And we've also included a mapping to mark in this particular example. And from our perspective, you know, there may be a difference between what RDA says about the cardinality and our own application. As Gordon mentioned, RDA may say there's no limit to the number of times that you can repeat an attribute. We might have a reason for limiting that. RDA may say that something is optional or it's not mandatory. At least almost nothing in RDA is mandatory. Some things are desirable for a effective description, but we have in conjunction, and you know, like any other library, we have our own policies on what elements we should include in a description, and those may be driven by membership of other organizations such as PCC, NACO, etc., or they may be simply driven by an internal requirement to document postcards in a particular way, as Gordon suggested. So I've included a column that says that these things are required or they could be optional for our own purposes. And this example, which is of manifestation data, they all seem to be required. I'd also been thinking about, at least within the work, expression, manifestation, and item entities, having what you might regard as generic elements, which would form a kind of basic template that would be a starting point for catalogers and for workflows. And then we could potentially specify other types of information or other categories that would go into other templates. So you could add on information about unpublished materials, for example, or a separate set of information that would be required for published materials. And as Gordon said, you could imagine a situation where this might actually be capable of tailoring the view that you have of the toolkit so that you only see those attributes, those elements that you require for a particular type of resource. Yeah, so I forgot about the animations. And from that, you can obviously produce an input sheet or template, for example. So that's, I'm not going to talk about policy statements because Thurston's already done that to death this morning, earlier on. But what I was going to mention was workflows, because you'll have seen in the current toolkit, or many of you will have seen the current toolkit, that the British Library has produced workflow documents which basically provide a narrative for catalogers to follow, because the way that instructions are organized in RDA doesn't always follow the approach that catalogers might take to the item in hand. And that is even more the case, I think, in the new version of the toolkit. So we think that workflows will still be important, but how are we going to determine what we put into the workflows? And I think the driver for that will be the application profiles. So as I said, it will provide a narrative to mediate between the cataloger and the text. It will be, they will be supplemented by additional guidance documents, and our workflows will include MARC examples. And we are aiming for a more consistent presentation and much less detailed description than we've gone for in the past. There is an example workflow actually in the toolkit. If this was done almost 2 years ago, actually, I think so. But if anyone wants to have a look at it, it's there. We haven't really developed anything further because kind of wanting to get started on the application profiles, and we want the policy documents available before we can really begin to flesh out the workflows. So that's, I'll stop sharing that document now. Find the button to do that. Okay, and I will briefly give you a quick look at RINF and how it does templates. If I can show that. hopefully everyone can see the desert landscape with a hint of spring. It seems very appropriate for the current situation. Right, so this is RIMF, which is RDA in many metadata formats developed by the Markov Quality, Richard and Deborah Fritz. And they've used templates which are populated effectively from the RDA registry as a way of enabling you to input data into RIMF for each RDA entity. So if we look at the file menu, you can create a new record for for example, a manifestation. So if I do that, it will provide me with a bewildering selection of templates to choose from. And this, I think, reflects the complexity that we're all trying to handle. It's not that RDA makes things complicated. It is that things are complicated, and RDA is a way of navigating through that complexity. So I can choose from this range of templates. I know that this might be quite small on your screens, but the one that I'm going to choose is the base not the base non-aggregate template, which is the top one. One of the pre-recording decisions you probably have to make is whether you've got an aggregate or a non-aggregate, and really the difference is in the elements that you will be offered in the template and the relationships that you will create once you've established your descriptions. So it's an important distinction to make. It's also simpler at the moment to just look at the non-aggregates. So if we look at that, then you can see that we've got quite a manageable number of attributes in this template, some of which will be hopefully very familiar: title proper, edition, statement of responsibility, and it carries on for a few more. Now the clever thing is, and I've got some further examples of this later, is that you can actually add to this template. So once you've filled in the basis of your description, the title proper, date of publication, etc., you can add additional information based on the type of resource that you're working with. So if you click on the switch template plus sign, you can select from your list of templates what you want to do. So for example, we could select audio if we have an audio recording, and that will put in some more attributes, which you will see. Let me just do that again. So never do a demonstration live, that's what they say. Fortunately, I will stop sharing that and move to my PowerPoint, which I prepared earlier today. Okay, some of that's so this is an example that I
can't see your screen, Alan.
You can't see it. Oh, sorry. Don't know what's happening there then. Let me just I think I've got the right thing now.
Yeah, we can see it.
See it, okay. So what I oh God, let's try and put this on purple on this slideshow. What I did was if we start off with a manifestation, we can oh, sorry, I just realized that it's gone to the wrong slide. That's the slide I was going to show you first. So we start off with the manifestation. You can see that on the left-hand side, we've got all the element labels, and on the right-hand side, we've got data that I filled in earlier. And we have those generic elements, essentially things that would apply to pretty much any type of resource. But by adding in the audio template, we can get specific elements specific to audio, such as equipment or systems requirement, type of recording, configuration of playback channels. And that's just an example. There are other elements that we could have, but just don't happen to apply to this particular resource. And then once we've finished our manifestation, we can open a new template for the expression and relate it to the manifestation. And again, we can select from a variety of different expression level templates, one of which will be a sort of basic expression level template like this one. And you can see that it's already linked to the Malinowski collection cylinder that we described. And then we can add more information into that template. And again, we can add additional elements to the template depending on the kind of resource that we got. Now, in this case, I had a wax cylinder. Well, didn't personally have a wax cylinder, but there is a wax cylinder in the library's collection, which contained folk music from the Trobriand Islands recorded in 1918. And so I can add specific recording elements, which are mostly down at the bottom here, from by adding another template onto the existing one, basically extending the range of elements that I've got available to me. So I've got place of capture, duration, date of capture, and who recorded, who made the recording. And because this is music, in fact, and it's a performance, I can add additional elements to record performance. So who was the performer, for example, and that kind of thing. So here we actually have the performer having been added in. Once we've gone through, and I think in this case, I started off with a sort of basic template, and I went through about 3 extensions to the template, all of which were really straightforward to do, just for different aspects of the expression. The fact that it's a recording, the fact that it's music that's being performed, and so on. And then, having done that, we can open up a template to relate to a work and create a new work. And there's the basic work template. And in this case, at the moment, I mean, I was doing this morning, but there aren't that many attributes of the work to record. And I notice I haven't recorded the category of the work yet, I haven't finished this, basically, is what I'm saying. So we, no, actually, I tell a lie, I did finish it. Can everyone see that? I've got something. The one thing about Zoom that I really hate is the bit you want to read has always got part of the display over it. The Zoom chat and everything. So, can I get rid of that? So I'm just trying to change my view so that I can see what I'm actually trying to read to you. I can't see anything doing that. I'm just going to reorganize it so that I can actually see what I'm doing. Okay, so we did actually, so this is, so I filled in the work template, as you can see, and we can record, you know, the category of work. We can record the that there's essentially it's ballads, it's narrative songs. We can record the preferred title of the work, and we can record information about the work in a note, and it's related to the expression of the work. We can, as I've said earlier, relate all of these things to persons or organizations associated with the resource. And that works in exactly the same way. Any entity, you will have a basic template, and then you'll have templates that you can add into build up your description. So I'm just going to stop sharing that now because it's probably about as much as anyone needs to see of that. So what we've got in RIMF, I think, is quite an interesting illustration of how RDA templates can be used to build up quite complicated descriptions. And those templates are essentially application profiles that could be used or a model for application, one kind of model for application profiles that we could look at. But the basic structure of the application profile is probably going to start off as a spreadsheet, as tabular data. But we can break it down in various ways to make it easier to consume by the cataloger. So, I think I'm probably about ready to answer questions now if anyone has any. I think that's...
Thanks, Alan. I think we can move to the sort of round table discussion now, so it's not all on you. I'm just going to share with everybody a link to the RIMF page so that anybody interested in playing with RIMF themselves can easily access it. I would recommend it as a way of getting to grips with the potential structure of data out with the Mark straitjacket. It's a really useful training tool. And of course, we've all got so much spare time during these COVID times. What else would you want to do but play with metadata? So Gordon and Thurston, I think you're unmuted too, and we can talk more about application profiles and so on. I like the approach of RIMF in terms of it giving you the templates, so you're focused on the particular elements that are of interest, and it is a really useful starting point when it comes to application profiles. Of course, the fact that we're not usually cataloguing in RIMF means that we're going to expect some other format. You mentioned workflows, Alan. Are they how you see the initial approach to a practical tool?
I think, well, I think there's different things, aren't there? Because we've got RINF is demonstrating a kind of input method, and everyone's input methods are going to be dependent on the systems that they have. So there's a requirement really to have some join up between the application profiles that we want and the systems that we've got.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that we can do by configuring our own systems, but some of it's much deeper and requires changes to systems and the way in which systems work, I think. And that's something that has to be taken forward through dialogue with the system developers and vendors. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's really within the scope of individual libraries to necessarily achieve, unless your system's sufficiently open that you can put your own front end on it. So the workflows themselves are really an aid to decision making, I would say. It's a way of filtering down the amount of information in the toolkit and driving it through specific and providing a sort of path through description of particular types of material. So I guess it's an interim step between what we have now and what Gordon envisages for the future, where the toolkit itself can create those pathways.
The other uses, Alan has said, we've seen applications being used to drive input templates, but they can be flipped around and used as the back end. So there are two related additional functions of application profiles, and those are selection and quality control. So if you have a large mass of metadata that's been aggregated from many, many different sources and all merged together, then you can use an application profile to say, well, we've ended up with 3 content types here. Choose one of them, because in our application only one content type is allowed. And so you can use your application profile almost as a kind of grabber. I've been trying to explain this for years and never come up with a nice solid simile. But you know those machines you get in fairgrounds that go down and grab presents and take them over? Well, you can imagine a very sophisticated grabber, which is a kind of shape, which is your application profile, and it goes into this cloud of metadata and literally sucks out the data you need for your application. So this selection from a larger mass of metadata is another function, and closely tied in with that is the idea of quality assurance. So if your application profile specifies that something is mandatory, and you come across a metadata description set where that piece of data is missing, then you've got a quality assurance problem. If you specify that you can only have one title proper, and you come across a record that has 2 titles proper in it, then you've got another quality assurance problem. And sometimes you can use the application profile to resolve the issue in the same way that the grabber just takes what it needs. Yeah, and that's why they've combined these 2 things. So you can clean up data using an application profile as well. It won't create data magically out of nothing, but it can discard data that is not in the profile and which would be considered to be noise in the application. Not noise in another application, but in your specific application, it's data that's not only unwanted, but its presence impacts in a negative way on the service that you're trying to run. So I think that needs to be borne in mind as well.
I think that's certainly something that we've got in our minds. There's probably different ways in which we're thinking about applying that. We're certainly looking at it. We have application profiles in the sense we have import profiles and export profiles. Most people probably do have those in their institutions, and it's one of the things obviously that we need to review when we move to new, well, it's one of the things we usually need to review when we make any major changes to the way in which we catalogue, whether it's new mark fields or whether it's new instructions from RDA. So, and I think what the application profile perhaps does is provide us with one source for all of those things that we can adapt to the different requirements that we have, because we don't just have one export profile, of course, or one import profile. We have them for different products and for different sources of information. So I guess the application profile becomes the sort of authority for all of those things, which is something that we're kind of lacking at the moment. Each one's kind of developed in its own right. And so in that sense, I would see the application profile as being potentially as a time saver. I know, from a quality assurance perspective, again, we have profiles that we use for quality assurance, which are very similar in some respects to the import-export profiles. And then running all of these things from one source would perhaps be a significant time saver.
I think the other interesting question it raises is in cases where your application profile specifies that only one instance of a element should be recorded, and you're looking to derive data from sources which may potentially record more than one instance of data, which may thus be ambiguous or indeed contradictory, whether any data should be recorded for that element whatsoever. There are certainly sort of issues that have arisen in the context of mark development over the past year or so to do with elements such as the extension plan, where you're presented with a set of mutually exclusive values, and certain parts of the community, because of their record models, would be interested in recording more than one value within the context of the description. But from the perspective of the functionality that results in, you may have a set of values that are incompatible with each other. And being that there is such a low bar now set in terms of so to speak, a core description for RDA, it raises the question of whether under those circumstances the element should be avoided entirely.
Yeah.
The comment I would make is, I've made this several times to Thurston, is that Mark 21 itself is an application profile, particularly in the context of RDA, because there are limitations on the mark encoding. There are assumptions made in the mark encoding about repeatability, for example. And so because RDA, it says nothing about repeatability, it only has this very low barrier minimum mandatory stuff, which for the sake of the discussion consists solely of a human readable label for the thing you're trying to describe so that everybody else knows what you're talking about. That's it. So Mark 21 itself, and indeed all encoding systems, are probably latent application profiles. In the encoding itself imposes certain application rules, such as cardinality, which are implicit but not explicit. And it's only when you get a larger framework like RDA, and RDA is not the only one that's emerging, you get this suddenly what is latent and understood by a particular community suddenly needs to be made explicit and exposed. And when you get the friction that goes on between the Mark 21 encoding format and RDA, and this friction is quite healthy. I'm not saying, I mean, it's unavoidable and healthy because it leads to these kinds of discussions. Then I think it does make it quite interesting, and it exposes the kind of hidden assumptions that we've all been making in our various cataloging traditions for a number of years. And those assumptions now, as we move into the international scene, rub up against one another, which is the whole history of basically the development of RDA and why it's gone in the direction it's gone in, is to accommodate these differing points of view. But I think certainly Mark 21 needs to be seen, in my opinion, as a latent application profile. And so if you use RDA in Mark 21, you are already applying a hidden latent set of assumptions that comes from probably the Anglo-American cataloging tradition, but it's difficult to find out because they're implicit, not explicit. And you get all sorts of interesting discussions on RDAL as a result.
Yeah, that's why I've found working outside Mark and things like RIMF to be so helpful in terms of the training and developing my thinking about metadata, because I had been so used to the invisible straitjacket of Mark that getting outside of that is definitely helpful to seeing some of the constraints that you hadn't realized were present. We've only got 10 minutes left, and we were planning to look at vocabulary using the type of binding issue. Shall we?
I suggest that might just be a bit too much, and we'll run out of time, and it's not fair to Thurston. However,
the Thurston show next time.
It will be the Thurston show, because this is also relevant to the discussion on recording methods. So that's our escape clause. Thurston can lead us through that. I think it's a really interesting discussion that needs to be exposed to a wider audience, because it is about practical cataloging decisions. What do you do when you have a choice of vocabularies, values that you can put in, etc., etc.? But let's not rehearse the discussion. So yeah, I suggest that we apologize again to Thurston because we've run out of time, and shift it to the final webinar series.
I'll recap at the end of the session about all the things we're going to discuss in 3 weeks' time. What shall we chat about for the next 5 minutes or so?
Might be worth talking about NBK, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we're talking about application profiles, and we're talking about community policies and so forth. I think it's interesting to speculate about how the new NBK services, the cataloging hub, etc., might develop in this context, and how institutions might want to apply their own application profiles to pulling stuff out of NBK, for example. Or indeed NBK might want to apply application profiles to how people put things in.
I don't know where we're at with NBK. You know, I'm retired, so
well,
last I heard, they were looking at metadata, what we would call application profiles. In fact, the minimum description level metadata, but that was 3 years ago, 2 years ago. Something.
Yeah, I think we've managed to, in the discussions around the what people require, I think we've managed to move away from the concept that there is such a thing as a minimum description, because everyone's view of what the minimum description should contain is different. And obviously, given the diversity of content and karyotypes, you can't have a minimum that is minimal.
If you put everybody's minimum together, you end up with a maximum.
Exactly. So, and really what we're looking at, and I think this in the British Library, but what we're looking at now is not thinking about what is the minimum we can get away with, but what value do we need to add? Because really all of cataloging now is about adding value to what somebody else has already done. There's usually, I'm generalizing horrendously here, but unless you're dealing with manuscripts and archives, which are in physical form, there will normally be something that you can base your metadata around. And there may well be a basic description, or there may well be a very good description from BDS or someone else that you can build on. So what we're really looking at is adding value. What value do we add to the metadata that we acquire or generate from other sources? And I think actually the whole model that RDA and the LRM has created has given us a framework in which we can express that value because it is so tied into the user tasks. And it's a tool for advocacy as well as for cataloging.
I agree.
Yeah, and in many regards, most of us have been doing that for a very long time, but it formalizes the thought processes. I regularly get asked, why don't we just use the data from publishers? Why does BDS have to do anything to it? And it's because our users, our libraries, who require the data to be in standard presentation and to apply authority control to name headings and to apply standard schema to subject description. So that's a straightforward use. You know, it's all about the user.
It's about the end user.
Yeah.
And I think to pick up on that, it really is about authority control and navigation more than about description. I think that has been a significant shift in thinking. How you describe things is neither here nor there. We're human beings, we've got human brains, and we can kind of work it out once we see two different descriptions. But the authority control, how you get to those descriptions, how you navigate through complex data sets, that's where the value, I think, is.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that requires a human intervention. The description can be done by machine, or it certainly can be machine assisted. You know, you can get machines to tell you roughly what the subject heading of a printed text is these days. But what you can't get machines to do is think and to know, this is AI I'm talking about, to get beyond what we see in Google, because Google spent a hell of a lot of money trying to make everything smarter in Google, and I see no visible effects. And I understand why. But I think the role of libraries here is authoritative. It's to say that this application profile has been well considered, well thought out. If your data fits the application profile, then it's authoritative data. It's the quality assurance thing again. But furthermore, I mean, larger organizations like the British Library surely should focus on not authority control per se, but making sure that the links between things are as accurate and as detailed as possible.
That is certainly part of our. I've been working on a new sort of QA approach for the library over the last year. And one of the things that we are much more focused on is putting things in context.
Mm-hmm.
And so within the QA evaluation, the highest quality of records are those that have lots of contextual links. And if they don't have those contextual links, they can't be in that category. They have to, they're a lower grade of record, if you like. So, and I think this is really important because it is these relationships that enable navigation and actually, from a researcher's perspective, add value because they are able to find things in ways that they can't from a simple description.
Thank you. That's a very good high point to round us off on, I think, Alan, given we're now at the end of our allotted time. So in 3 weeks' time, on the 26th of February, we will convene again to discuss recording methods in RDA, the implementation scenario within Mark 21 and the Mark 21 developments to support that, and look at use cases with local vocabularies with the magnificent help of Thurston, who will have most to do on that session. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Have a pleasant weekend.
Thank you, Jenny. Same to you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.